like to get started now. Oh. I think we're ready to get started. If folks could find their seats and conclude their conversations. That didn't really work. Anyone else want to try? Well, welcome to our final session today. Welcome to our final session entitled Can't Get You Out of My Head. After an entire day, I don't think that's a challenge for anyone to get SIBs out of their head, and we're prolonging the fixation, so we apologize for that. But we do think we prepared a very valuable discussion and hope to add something new to where the field's been the past several years and the discussions today, hopefully. My name's John Tambornino. I'm a senior advisor in the White House Office of Management and Budget. I'm part of the Career Civil Service. For a number of years, I've been in the role of kind of the lead coordinator for SIB and Pay for Success activity at the federal level. Nothing I say should necessarily be construed as the official position or policy of the White House Office of Management and Budget or the U.S. government. People snicker when I say that, but it's absolutely true. These individuals, on the other hand, are voicing the official, their official positions in some ways. So we, again, have a great set of panelists. To my left is Scott Kleiman, who's with the Government Performance Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Dr. Carolyn Heinrich, who's a professor of public policy and education at Vanderbilt University. Adrian Brown, the executive director at the Center for Public Impact. And Dr. Mildred Warner, who's professor of city and regional planning at Cornell University. Their bios are in the materials. I won't detail them. Suffice to say, they're all accomplished experts. There's a biographical fact also that at least 4 of us share in common. We're all suffering jet lag, I think. So we'll try to conceal that and forgive us if it's apparent. Well, and the premise of the panel is that the original SIB model has been exceptionally attractive and inspiring to government, service providers, stakeholders, continues to garner serious resources and talent, as we have amongst us today in this room. Yet, as we've been discussing so far today, a decade into SIBs, it's certainly time to consider the original model, the rationale, the premise, the essential structure, and to continue the conversation we've been having today of whether we're too beholden to the original model. And in reconsidering the SIB model, it's useful to recollect the principles that motivated the SIB model originally. These questions include the extent to which the reality of SIBs has reflected these principles and goals that motivated them to begin with, whether SIBs can realistically become a primary means of advancing these principles and achieving these goals, whether alternative program funding models and evaluation models offer better means of advancing these principles and goals, and how experience with SIBs may have exposed limitations in the principles themselves, and perhaps the need for alternative paradigms and approaches for delivering services, for program funding and administration, and evaluation and learning. So those are overarching questions we'd like to wrestle with. I'd like to first pose a brief question to the panelists to allow themselves to introduce themselves further, but with regard to SIBs, and to ask each of you to say just briefly, given the breadth of your interests and experience and the trajectory of your careers, what in particular led you to focus on SIBs? And in focusing on SIBs, what's been most unique and has most drawn your attention?
Sure. As John said, I'm Scott Kleiman. I'm a program director with the Government Performance Lab. Many of you may have known us from our original name, which was the Social Impact Bond Technical Assistance Lab. And we'll talk a little bit more about sort of the history of our evolution from an organization that focuses specifically on helping governments in the U.S. with this particular kind of innovation called the Social Impact Bond or Pay for Success contract to what we do right now, which is providing government-side technical assistance around improving outcomes from all core spending in states. Just a little bit about us. So we are about a 40-person organization within the School of Government at Harvard. We exist, and this sort of speaks to some of the original interest in social impact bonds, because when we looked around, we saw that innovation wasn't happening quickly enough in tackling the most challenging social problems out there. One of my favorite sort of quotes that people have talked about is looking at childhood leukemia. And childhood leukemia 50 years ago, for 80% of kids, was a death sentence. 50 years later, 80% of children survive childhood leukemia. We haven't seen nearly the same kinds of innovation in solving our most challenging social problems, whether it's homelessness, whether it's abuse of young children, whether it's criminal justice involvement. And government is where, in the US and across the world, so much of the money flows through. And so for us, working in government as a way to accelerate new innovations, new learnings, adapt new models, that was the big draw initially of this social impact bond model, was that you could introduce a bunch more flexibility and innovation focused on outcomes when we knew there weren't good enough solutions. I'll just say one more thing, because I think it speaks to sort of how I look at the world. We discovered along the way that implementation of all this stuff is really hard, and that one way to help governments pull this off is by embedding a member of our team in governments. And so in all the work we do, and what we primarily do, is embed full-time members of our staff in government for 12 to 24 months to help governments pull off one of these complicated reform projects, whether it's a social impact bond or some other kind of reform. Today, almost everything we do is not the social impact bond stuff. It's helping governments integrate some of these ideas into their core spending.
Thank you. Carolyn.
So one of the things that attracted me to studying this issue was the fact that it seemed to encompass a lot of things that we've been looking at for decades. So the shift to focusing on outcomes-based performance and how we evaluate our public programs, including social programs. And so, I mean, I thought a lot of these components aren't that new, right? We've been doing public-private partnerships, we've been doing contracting for outcomes-based, but there were some things that I thought were exciting, in part because of my experience studying these. For example, performance standards in programs, and when we actually condition payments on meeting particular outcomes, they can be gamed. And so the idea that we were going to now actually try and measure impacts and actually project over a longer term and push people to measure impacts in longer term was, to me, exciting. Now, whether we've done that in practice, I think there's been discussion already today that often we aren't measuring impacts as rigorously as we originally intended. And also this question about whether the actual contracts are looking to monetize savings in the future. So just one quick example, because I'm going to talk later about pay for success or SIBs in preschool. So one of the programs that's considered a success in the U.S., their outcome that they were paid on was whether or not kids avoided special education services. And to me, that's a short-term, very gameable outcome, and not something I would have expected for us to be paying on in a SIB arrangement.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I've really enjoyed the conversation so far, so I hope I've got something sufficiently interesting to say to contribute to that debate. I run an organization called the Center for Public Impact. We're a not-for-profit foundation, and our mission is to try and work with governments to improve their effectiveness broadly. So we don't focus on SIBs or pay for success specifically. We're interested in effectiveness more broadly. Why I'm interested in SIBs, or my background in relation to SIBs, I suppose, is I'm a bit geeky. And having been a management consultant for a little while, I went to work in the UK Cabinet Office and started working in the delivery unit, as it then was. And that brought me into this world of measuring outputs, really, as they were then, thinking about outcomes, thinking about performance improvement in public services. And it was a very exciting time. It was the Blair administration. This delivery unit was a new thing, and I was like this young guy just lucked out to get there. It felt like a very innovative, very exciting time to be in government and to start to raise some of these questions about how do we really think about performance, about impact measurement, about improvement, about results that can improve people's lives. And then roll the clock forward, once SIBs started to appear in the UK, I was extremely interested in that. I was working at a think tank called the Institute for Government at the time, studied the Peterborough model, and then subsequently went on to help government departments who were thinking about pay for success and outcomes-based approaches, design them and implement them in one way or another. So I've been through the journey, I feel, as I've sort of grown up in my career in government effectiveness and government performance. I'll leave the punchline as to where I've concluded that journey till the next set of remarks.
So I'm a planner, and I work with local governments, and I'm interested in how governments provide services. And I've studied contracting for quite a few decades, and SIBs is sort of contracting on steroids. And so on that sense, it was of interest to me. But I also have a piece of work I do a lot of work on economic development policy. And economic development policy is structured very differently from social welfare policy. It's based on incentives, whereas social welfare policy is usually based on rigid rules and regulations or hit you if you do it wrong. And so I wondered if we might be able to flip the script and think about an incentive-based approach that might enhance our investment in social welfare policy, because the U.S. severely underinvests in social welfare policy. So I spent about 15 years working with chambers of commerce and employers around enhancing investment in early childhood education, and using business and economic development logics to enhance investment. And then along the way, I began to hear about this thing called Invest in Kids bonds, and they were worried about how to securitize the investment in the 2-year-olds so they could get paid back when the child grew up. And I thought, that sounds like a 21st century version of indentured servitude. I don't think I want that. And then I noticed that it morphed into this thing called a social impact bond that viewed the public sector as the payer. And so you're not going after the kid when the kid grows up. You're going after the public sector who might find a savings somewhere along the line. And what I'm actually interested in is whether SIBs could actually be turned on markets themselves to private actors to have them be the payer, and so that they'll be incentivized to create a more socially responsible private market.
Thank you. So I'd like to first present a question to you, Scott. As you explained, you originally your organization was the Social Impact Bond Lab, and it evolved into the Government Performance Lab. And you've begun to describe this, but talk more about just how your thinking and your organization's thinking has evolved. And in particular, given that you've moved away from doing SIBs, they're no longer the preferred model. You start few new SIB projects. Why is that? Yeah. What limitations have become apparent over the years?
So I want to tell two stories, hopefully quickly, although that always seems to jinx me. And they're two stories of projects that we worked on that I think reflect sort of our evolution and how the governments that we work with have evolved. So early on in my time at what was then the Social Impact Bond Lab, there was a government child welfare agency who had challenges around teenagers in the foster care system with really long stays in group care. And they were interested in using this social impact bond tool as a way to find new ways to support these young people in their families or in family-based settings, rather than these young people essentially living for years and years in institutional treatment, and thought that the social impact model could be a way to drive that sort of change. So over the course of 2 years, I spent pretty much 100% of my time over the course of 2 years helping the state develop this social impact bond. And it was delivering services to 200 young people a year. And some of the earlier results have been quite promising. Then there's another state, and this is the state we worked in a couple years later, who had a similar challenge. They had too many young people in their foster care system in group care. They asked for our help redesigning the entire array of services the department contracted with, about 40% of the state's budget. And what we did there was help them write a contract that was problem-based, outcome-based, where they said, we've got this population of young people who are too often in congregate settings. We're looking for new solutions. What provider community can you offer us? They said, we want to make it really clear that kids succeeding in families is the most important thing here, and we want to give you providers information about how you're doing once that kid leaves their care. So we're going to make a very small part of this contract, under 5%, linked to whether these young people are no longer in group care. And we know that this is going to be really hard to pull off. So we want to start meeting with you once a month, and we're going to be looking at the individual kids in care, and we're going to be problem solving with you around barriers on our end where social workers maybe aren't being responsive about moving kids out of a group home when they need to be, and helping you look at your data to identify where there are barriers and what are solutions together. And so we did that. Resulted in 116 contracts, resulted in the addition of a new treatment foster care model that hadn't existed in this place, about a 50% increase in foster homes, and about a 25% reduction in group care placement. And from sort of the first project was $5 million a year of services. The second project is about $90 million a year of services and 40% of what the state does. And that became sort of the fundamental thing that the governments that we were working with asked us. They said, these social impact bonds are really interesting. They're changing the nature of how we think about our providers. They are allowing us new ways to sort of go out and do procurement. They are forcing us to rethink how prescriptive we are with governments, with our providers. They're creating mechanisms for us to be actually using data in real time rather than just retrospectively, but they take a heck of a lot of work, and they're really hard for us to pull out. Can't you help us apply this to the core of what we do? And so this has been the evolution for us, where we now, almost everything we do is around helping government, and a lot of it is around sort of these social service innovations, but things that will feel very familiar to people who've been in the social impact bond pay for success space. So reforming traditional procurements to be way less prescriptive than traditional, much more about putting out a problem in a population and asking for creative solutions. Re-engineering this relationship between providers and government, so it's not this hand-slapping one, but instead where they're in real time trying to figure out what's working, what's not, and adjusting it. And then the third piece that's not quite reflected in this story, but I think is really important, is also sort of bringing a point of view around who providers are responsible for serving, being not just those who show up for services, but broadening out in contracts and conversations with providers saying, there's a whole population here of families at risk. We expect you to figure out ways to give them every chance to engage in services rather than just focusing on the mothers who show up for nurse home visiting, who walk in the door saying, I need some help. Because those often aren't the people who, when we look on the back end of having the worst outcomes, are the ones that really need it.
That's great. So when, if ever now, do you initiate or encourage or advise a new SIB project? Is the government does want to transfer 100% financial risk? A social investor is only interested in doing a SIB? I mean, when is it the best tool?
So I'll give you the theoretical answer, and then I'll give you the real answer. So right now, so we have worked on more than half the SIBs in the U.S. And right now, we think there are probably three good reasons to do a social impact bond, and you probably need to see some combination of three things to make it worth it. One, and this speaks directly to what Stefan was saying this morning, was this idea of something like this money-back guarantee can be a way to overcome sort of political unwillingness to invest in prevention. that it's a really useful talking point. And when you see both sort of political leaders and also civil servants who are quite risk averse, this can be a way of overcoming political risk. And I think, frankly, that's sort of the single most important thing here, is it's not about financial risk, it's not about innovation, it's about when sort of the politics don't allow you to make smart policy. The second place is where, because there is this sort of short-term, very defined nature of a social impact bond, setting up a new program can prevent programs from being locked into a budget forever. We see this sort of habit in governments where they fund a program once, and then it's really hard to remove that from a budget. Making at the end of a contract, making government have to opt in to extending it versus opt out from extending it can be useful when you want to overcome some of the inertia that comes in, but there are also other ways to do that. And then the third one is a lot of the problems that we talk about require this sort of cross-organizational collaboration over time. Earlier there was a session on the West London zone, and I think what struck me was that it was such a great example of, you've got this population that doesn't really fit within any traditional agency's purview. You've got young people who are disconnected. Schools aren't really responsible for them because they're not showing up in schools. The child welfare system or foster care system not really responsible because they haven't been abused or neglected. The police system's not really responsible. Juvenile justice system's not really responsible. But yet these are really vulnerable teenagers, and solving that challenge requires the kind of cross-silo collaboration and political leadership to go have everyone sit around the table. That there's something about this sort of fancy, sexy tool called a social impact bond, where somebody like what we do is we can join the commissioners at a meeting, and us being there sort of prompts people to show up when they wouldn't if their peers were called. And so some of these places where you've got populations that fall through the cracks, that you need this sort of cross-agency, cross-sectoral reform, that a social impact bond can be really a powerful thing to do. So that's the theoretical model. The practical answer is we almost always now, when a government comes to us and say, we want to do a social impact bond, our answer is, what's the problem you're really trying to solve here? And let's unpack if the barriers that you are facing are the ones that actually line up with what a social impact bond is good at. And almost always the answer is there's a way that we think is more likely to get results more quickly at a lower sort of cost of everyone's time, attention, resources.
Thank you, that's great. Carolyn, recently you completed a study of applicants and recipients for a federal Pay for Success grant opportunity, and the program model that the grantees were developing in their projects, if they were funded, was in many ways a traditional SIB Pay for Success sort of program model. Tell us what you found in your study.
Sure. So this is for the U.S. Department of Education that basically put out for a request for calls to fund feasibility pilots. So all of the applicants were applying because they wanted to work towards into the feasibility phase and possibly moving into a full-scale Pay for Success social impact bond arrangement. And so preschool programs are a pretty good starting point for us in the U.S., and so it's not coincidence that both Mildred and I have studied this, and that's in part because we already have a really strong evidence base that says they return about $7 to $10 on every dollar we spend. So it was also the case when I looked at the applications that many of those that were applying already had very strong public-private collaborations and these arrangements, right, for doing it. They'd already been braiding funding from different sources, figuring out how to do this. And because of that, they'd also had to, in some sense, figure out the outcomes they're documenting. And so a lot of that part wasn't new. And as it turns out, when I, talk to both those who are funded and not funded, one of the primary motivations for pursuing it was just it's another source of funding. They're coping with the constraints. And so some of them thought, and you mentioned, Scott, the political climate, right? So some of them were in states where, it's very conservative and getting additional, public funds to support this. So they thought, if we can do this, we can demonstrate that this can produce these impacts in a way that is rigorously measured. It'll have kind of proof of concept. And then we can set this thing aside and get our government just to fund these programs, right? Because they all believe that's kind of what it should have been doing, right? We should be funding these, but you're forcing us to go out and have to figure out how we are going to get the funding we're not getting. They ran into a lot of challenges. So the most difficult identified was getting prospective payer. For preschool programs, often it was school districts or another maybe county government, another, or even state government entity, depending on how large they wanted to go. And you know, the payers were also looking at, for example, if you're a school district, well, what if we pay for these kids early on and then they move out of school district and someone else gets the results, and we're still stuck with all this work and effort and costs. Some had a hard time finding an intermediary or had procurement rules that required them to have a competitive procurement, and there just weren't enough intermediaries out there and affordable. So I think that's the other issue, is that putting that together, getting the expertise on board, there's a real cost to it, and so it's something they had to do. The financial modeling and contract negotiations they found to be really complicated. We're pushing through it. So one of the interesting things we did was ask them, you know, at the start, how confident were you that this was going to work out to a full-scale pay for success arrangement? And then at the end, how did you feel? And so those who had the most experience, maybe had worked with one previously, were the least, I guess, positive or thought it was actually going to work out. So maybe estimating maybe 5 to 10% chance this is going to work. Those with the least experience were more optimistic. In the end, most didn't actually think it was going to be a long-term viable strategy. And some of the things we've been talking about, right? It is hard, but to put kind of a positive note on it, they did see some benefits, right? So some it forced them to work in collaboration with others to get access to data, right? That they needed to measure outcomes in specific ways that they may not have done without the push from Pay for Success. And also just the idea that they had a better idea working to try to bring people on board to support them, how they might need to sell this to their legislators or to other potential funders, and being able to then say, well, okay, we really have worked out to define these outcomes, and this is what we're doing. So I'll stop there.
That's great. I mean, it's not a representative sample, of course, but
Right.
What did you feel like you learned in terms of sort of more at the grassroots level, if you will, or the state and local level, the provider level, just what the appetite is and level of enthusiasm is for, and that you're talking to people who have devoted their careers not to social impact bonds or
Right.
performance, but rather to early childhood. So what was your sense in terms of just where the thinking was at that local level?
So at the local level, I think, to be honest, even those who were most experienced were saying, we'd rather, of course, just have a foundation grant that would fully fund us, and maybe one that was, you know, multi-year, so we didn't have to every year do this. But I think, you know, there were also some risks that people saw, and I think that are really important to acknowledge. That is that there is, I think, tension between, for example, the social investors and the people in the programs. Social investors have incentives, if they're going to get their payments, right, to contract on things that are shorter term, right, not longer term. We know from the literature, the research that's been done is that the challenge is a lot of those outcomes do emerge over time, right? They can go away initially and then come back. The benefits aren't seen till later. So you may never, ever really fully monetize those things. So kind of some of the ideals involved in a true social impact bond arrangement weren't necessarily coming out in practice or weren't necessarily doable. And so that takes away some of the luster of actually going forward and doing all this work if it's really, we're compromising on some things that would be important to making this truly a success. And I think the other thing too is just, you know, because of the investment of the staff and figuring out how to do this, the other relationships you have to develop, can that be sustained, you know, over time and to continue into a full-scale social impact bond?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question is for Adrian, and let me set it up by just observing that in much of the discussion in these sorts of gatherings, there's a consensus that the principles and the goals underlying social impact bonds that we're familiar with, but effective prevention, avoiding costly remedial services, the focus on outcomes, the ensuring rigorous evaluation and transparency, performance measurement, shifting financial risk, quantitative measures of value and benefits and savings. There's a consensus that those should be priorities. And the debate then is whether SIBs have in practice really manifest these priorities and whether they're the best means of doing so, as we're discussing already, and their prospects of doing so. But my question for you, Adrian, in a recent discussion we had, you suggested that some of these principles and goals should not necessarily be priorities in terms of government programs and service delivery. And some of the principles and goals that you believe should be priorities have sometimes been misconstrued or construed in ways in the SIB field that is counterproductive or short-sighted, harmful perhaps. So just say more about that if you could.
So, as I said in my opening remarks, I came from quite a managerial and technocratic and sort of scientific mindset. And that's a view of the world which we can all, there's a part of us, I think, part of everyone which likes to think the world looks like that. And that world is a world which we can understand through observation and analysis. We can be reductive and break problems down into their component parts to solve them. We can, if we want to be scientific about it, we can measure what we're doing. What the results of those things are. We can attribute the cause and effect. We can build causal models. And if we want to continue the logic, you can see where I'm going here. If you want to continue the logic with SIBs, we can price those things in a way that makes some sense and creates incentives that can work for people. And I think that set of ideas creates quite a nice, coherent worldview, which is a view of reality, which you might say, scientific reductionist belief that we can understand the world to a sufficient extent that we can actually do something about it and improve outcomes. And that's the world, and that set of values, that paradigm, I think, is the set that SIBs, at least as initially conceived, and I think there's a very interesting trend that I've observed today and in the other remarks here, of SIBs morphing into something which is away from this world, but at least as initially conceived. And if you want to take the pure review of SIBs, that's the world in which they fit, so they reinforce that worldview. And that worldview, makes a lot of sense to me. That's how I was trained in various parts of my life. I came to realize, though, I had a sort of nagging doubt inside me that, well, this world really makes sense on my PowerPoint slides and in my Excel spreadsheets. And people are very impressed when I go and talk to them about how, this leads to this, and here's a chart with some results going up because of these interventions over here. But I had a little voice in my head that said, but that's not really true, though. Is that actually how the world really is? And so there's another part of me that I sort of started to read up on this kind of thinking, which many people in this room will be familiar with, which is to think about the world not as a reductive machine that you can kind of take apart and put back together and understand, but as a complex system. And complex systems behave in very, very different ways. And we know there's a literature around this. There's people know a lot more about this than I certainly do. But some of the basic things I understand complex systems to be is you cannot apply, basically you can't use reductive logic on a complex system. So that doesn't work. You can't, causal models are not the way to think about complex systems. You need to think about relationships rather than the individual chain of A to B to C. It's very difficult. Outcomes are emergent properties of the complex system. An emergent property is not something you can plan in the same way as if you've built a motor car or a clock. There's a very good podcast, by the way, called The Clock and the Cat, which has a metaphor like a clock that's complicated, a cat is complex. You can't take a cat apart and understand it in fully for its cattiness. You can understand it a bit. you can't understand the nature of the cat by examining its parts, whereas the clock you can. So if the world is actually, so I suppose there's a question for you. Do you think the world and the types of challenges that we've been talking about today, homelessness, drug abuse, intergenerational poverty, the climate crisis, are these problems that are complicated, or are they complex? And if they're complex, why do we think that a tool that is built in the paradigm of reductionism and the complicated world is going to be any help at all in the complex world? And that's why I go further and say it's not just no help, it's misleading us. It's kidding us that we think we actually are doing more than we're doing, right? We're seeing results, we're seeing impact, we're congratulating ourselves on what's being achieved, and it's illusory. It's illusory because the outcomes that we claim aren't necessarily the outcomes that the people in the system see, right? Which is why we start to talk about, well, we're going to be designing them with the participants, and so we've got ways of sort of smoothing around that. It's complex because, you know, just trying to describe this measurable outcome here and here and here is never going to describe the summation of what we're seeing in these complex systems. And we're never really going to answer the question, did this intervention here lead to that outcome there? We're not going to answer that. So we face a choice. Either we take the SIB model and say, we reject this, we just need to improve our tools. We need to be better at impact measurement. We need to be better at attribution. We need to bring people in more collaborative. We need to basically finesse this tool. Or we say this tool has actually been built in a particular, very logical and completely consistent mindset, which is actually a mistaken view of reality in terms of the complex problems, social problems that we face. And if that's the case, SIBs are a solution looking for a problem. SIBs are saying, oh, you want to improve collaboration, a SIB can help you with that. That's the wrong way around. We should ask, if we want to improve collaboration, how can we improve collaboration? SIBs might be very, very far down that list because we're intelligent people. We can probably come up with a whole range of other ways to improve collaboration that don't involve a SIB. And for all the other things that people have mentioned, we can come up with many, many other ways that don't involve a SIB. So that's why I think it's a distraction. It's taking the collective intelligence of everybody in this room and directing it towards something which I think is actually the wrong path.
I'm a cat lover, but I still love the analogy of sort of the limits of the dissection and taxidermy given that, I mean, if one agrees with that, then what would you see as the model, given that a different epistemology, essentially, and ontology, if you will, what are different models of learning and evaluation that you think are appropriate, that are appropriate for this more complex world and its dynamic quality and tacit knowledge and those kinds of things? Could you say more about that?
When we start to think systemically and with complexity as one of our sort of founding principles, we recognize the fact that when we're asking a question, how can we improve measurement, we immediately end up faced with the question, well, who is it for? And if we're thinking about our traditional hierarchy, measurement is to feed the hierarchy so that we all know what's happening, the people at the top know what's happening, and we can kind of attribute resources and do that. But in a system, understanding what's happening is not for the people at the top, it's for the people in the system. So the worldview would be, when we're thinking about measurement and information systems, the exam question should be, how can we improve information system flows between actors, between players, so that they could be continuously learning, experimenting, and improving in situ. And much of that information isn't capturable in my beloved PowerPoint slides and Excel sheets. It's tacit knowledge in the heads of professionals who've got years of experience. And the only way that those people can really, you could write that down, I suppose, but it's about people meeting each other, talking to each other, interacting with each other, human to human. And we start to get worried, well, how can we extract that knowledge from that situation so that we can kind of observe it? We don't need to. That's the great news, because we just need to work out about how to start to join people up and create those information flows, and that will improve the system. So I won't go through, there are very many ways that once we start thinking in this different world, we can say, okay, we can solve this. We can do things to help the system be healthier. And that's our role if we're commissioners or people in public policy officials of one sort or another. Our role is to be enablers of a healthier system that's more likely to achieve the impacts that we all hope for. And I should give a name check actually to a chap called Toby Lowe, who I know is familiar with some of you in this room. He's an academic from Newcastle University. He's written some really good, very accessible guides for example, how to think about commissioning in complexity, which takes this worldview and says, right, you're a commissioner, you still have to do your job, so how are we going to think about commissioning in this worldview? I think it's the most exciting area of public policy at the moment, and I hope to recruit some of you to the cause.
We have already, apparently. But just finally, so your organization is then promoting projects that reflect this fairly radically different paradigm. Could you give just an example of how successful you've been or how far you've gotten in terms of this alternative approach?
So it's still very much early days, and we're not trying to be the only, we're certainly not the only organisation who's pushing some of these ideas. But for example, there are some really interesting models out there. As usual, the future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed, right? So we spend some of our time really trying to find the people who have got this new way of thinking, who are doing this out there in the world, and give them a platform and talk to them and understand what it is they're up to. And then we're also seeing if we can take some of those principles into different settings and see if we can sort of seed that idea somewhere else and let that grow. So one very interesting model, if you've read there's a book called Reinventing Organizations, which takes a radical new view of how organizations should be set up away from hierarchies. That features very many different types of organization, but one in the public sector is Buurtzorg, which is a nursing collaborative in the Netherlands. They used to be running with targets and metrics and all the rest of it in a hierarchy. It was extremely costly. It didn't really deliver the results. They moved to a self-managed approach, small teams of nurses who were self-managed, working in a particular patch. And that has been very, very effective in this home care nursing in the Netherlands, and we're asking now, what does that mean in, for example, children's social services in the UK? Or, how can we take some of these principles and apply them elsewhere?
That's great, thank you. Final question I'd like to pose is to Mildred, you've reflected and examined SIBs in recent years. As you said, that's after or as part of a much longer career in terms of studying government service delivery and administrative models and budgetary and financing issues. You haven't kept your skepticism to yourself, so say more about that. In discussions we've had in earlier presentations you've given, you've said that the certain values and principles are neglected in the SIB model, as I've understood you. So I wonder if you could say more about that. What do you think is really missing fundamentally in SIBs, and missing something that is inherently missing, or that inherently is going to be very difficult to keep in the SIB model? So if I'm being clear, what crucial values and principles are missing, would you say?
So I'm sorry, but I'm going to go negative. But I really like Adrian's positive alternative, so I hope we come back to that. If we think about the history of where SIBs came from, and this came up in the morning discussion, they came from austerity in the UK. And austerity was a result of market failure to self-regulate. That's what brought us the great global recession. And the austerity response in the UK led to a crisis, which led to the idea of a SIB. So this SIB market privileging tool arises from the worst global market failure in a century. So there's this curious zombie status of market-type reforms in the public sector. They just don't die. And in the face of that, it makes me wonder why we keep going back to privileging market-type reforms in the public sector. So I'm actually a conservative. I'm old-fashioned, and I believe in public services universally delivered, funded by progressive taxation schemes. And if we're going to use SIBs, I would like to use them to expand social welfare. And in some cases, that would involve expanding publicly funded programs and making them more effective. And in other cases, you would turn that market discipline back on the market itself and ask the market to be a more socially just, responsible, and environmentally sustainable market. And that would be awesome. And so if we could take this tool that emerges from a market privileging worldview and put it on marketized services, services that in your society, wherever that happens to be, you have decided belong in the private market, and so it's okay to use market mechanisms for them. But I think the core values of SIBs many of them are very misplaced for public services, services that we have decided belong in the public sector because of market failure. So high-stakes performance metrics lead to better program results, especially in complex social problems. That's a core assumption of SIBs. I don't think there's evidence to support it. And in fact, I think there's much evidence to the contrary. I'm thinking back to Yuri Bronfenbrenner, he's a noted human development scholar, and he was presenting before Congress. He'd be 110 if he were still alive today. And the authority said, all the research you've done, Dr. Bronfenbrenner, on what helps a child grow up well, what really matters? And he says, love. A child needs someone to love him or her unconditionally forever. I think that gets back to your idea of complexity. The second core value, external actors, evaluators, intermediaries, financiers, are better positioned than government to lead these initiatives. So bureaucracy is the problem, and we need networks controlled by outside interests to secure the most public value. And I'm like, help me out, Carolyn, but the public sector reforms of the turn of the 20th century were all about, they were developed precisely because outside interests did not support public values, and we needed to curb their influence. So what from the Great Recession gives us greater evidence and confidence today that private outside interests are more publicly oriented today than they were a century ago when we first created bureaucracy as the protection against that? Third, the idea is that we underinvest in prevention, and the way to increase investment is to prove effectiveness, and that the private business case might help in that process. Thus, I think and I actually do think there's some role here that the private business case can be used, and that's why I was looking at these kinds of economic development approaches for early childhood education. But then the true measure of SIB effectiveness would be the broader public policy change, increased funding for preventative services. And have we seen that? Most SIBs don't even have that as an outcome metric. And it seems to me that would be the primary justification for that, and that would result in an expansion of the social welfare state. The fourth SIB core value seems to be that outcome measures are more important than process management. And this will free providers from rigid process controls. But we see that the performance measures actually affect the process in ways that bias that process toward cream skimming, service denial. And we also need to remember that government service delivery is often coercive. And because of that, we have a lot of protections in there for due process. And so process is as important as outcome when you're dealing with government programs that can control your life against your will. Take your kids out of your home, for example. Fifth, that citizens and clients do not need a voice in SIB design. Father knows best. But now we're starting to see in sessions at this year's conference on how could you give more of a role for citizen and client involvement in public design. So this is good. The 6 is that SIBs promote innovation, but the evaluation schemes make innovation difficult and bias SIBs back toward proven interventions, not innovations. So again, how do you get the flexibility and the continuous learning? And there's lots of evaluation research over the last several decades on how to do that. But that was ignored and put aside so that we could privilege positivistic notions of randomized control trials. And then finally, that public scrutiny is not necessary because the evaluation process is enough. But SIBs are negotiated in secret. Full details are hard to find. The SIBs we've studied, we often can't get our hands on the documents because open government protections, which are common in America, don't always travel to the SIB contract. Okay, so what's the alternative? I'm conservative. Adequately fund government services, fund prevention programs based on what the research shows, and fund pilot innovations without the high-stakes monetized returns. If you really want to innovate, give some flexibility for that and don't link it to such high-stakes measurement outcomes. And allow public scrutiny in the process. What are you afraid of? Allow client voice and respect social rights. Because I think really important here is what we found in our work is that SIBs tend to be found in areas where social rights are uncertain. They're not in areas where social rights are clear. And what I'm worried about, we're on this shadow play, and we're looking at the actors and we're seeing their shadows, but we're not thinking about the canvas. And the canvas could be slowly shifting away from universal protections for education, for access to public services, housing, employee benefits, and could be shifting us ever so subtly to a market model that privileges and only funds what work. You know, if you're a parent, you have kids, and stuff doesn't work, you still do something. So government actually funds what works, and it funds what doesn't work. And it actually has an obligation to fund what doesn't work. When education doesn't work for a group of kids, yes, I'd love to figure out a way to better serve them. But in the meantime, we will serve them because they have a right to be served. And so I think we need to constrain this very interesting model to services that appropriately should be subjected to market discipline. And we need to be really careful in thinking in which culture, in which set of social values, which services are in that cultural world okay to be subject to market discipline in that kind of way, and which ones aren't. And not rush to apply this to areas that I think in the end could take us away. We all care about social welfare. We want to make a better world, but we don't want to undermine social rights that are at the foundation of that. And that's my fear, that in our effort to improve, we may actually undermine the social, shall we say, moral or ethical value basis for providing the services.
So we want to open it up to the audience before we conclude, and we've reserved some time for that. And what I was wanting to do is to give since we're having a lot of sort of contrarians fairly consistently on the panel regarding the value of SIBs, I wanted to give the audience an opportunity to sort of rebut those. But I'm hearing nothing but applause, so I don't know if anyone wants to do that. But quite seriously, we've heard a lot of skepticism. Are you persuaded? And if you're persuaded, are you persuaded that models indeed, practically speaking, have proven themselves more viable than SIBs to accomplish some of these goals?
Yeah, hi, Simon from the Red Cross. I mean, I think there's lots of laudable columns, and I think SIBs are quite intervention. I do think there's an enormous amount of hyperbole, and I think, we've studied, Simon from the Red Cross, and I think it's good that there's questions and quizzes. I do think there's a lot of hyperbole. I mean, SIBs today are $300 million Plenary or talk. Do we really think it's going to change public policy and things like that, and Western civilization is under threat by the size of this? I mean, that we spend so much time looking at it, I think is probably, also deeply problematic. I guess.
Don't stay, really. Yeah. Go on, I'm sorry.
No, but I think let's get a bit of perspective. So one is, I think the question is, do we have a right perspective? I think it's great that, it's good to have a challenge of it. And two is, how much of this is that kind of innovation curve, if at all, in that, there's a lot of excitement about something new, and then it comes off, and everyone goes, oh, this is the reality, it's not so good, and maybe, I guess, does the panel agree that this might be an innovation hump, or is this, a more fundamental problem? So, what do you think about perspective, and is this on the innovation curve?
Thank you. A number of hands shot up. I wonder if we could just get several questions and issues on the table, and then the panel can respond. So could the mics go around to...
This was Tim Gray. Talking about missions. There was a thought I had in response to what Adrian was saying about complexity and how solutions to complexity are essentially very often relationships people have with other people. To changing that rather than you can say, well, this intervention A is going to produce result B. But I think that it's certainly possible, I'm not saying that it's always true, for SIBs to be a vehicle for that sort of intervention, because rather than saying, well, here's a service specification and you have to do this, this, and this, and you want this, this, and this output as a result, what you can be saying is, here's some people who've got a certain type of difficulty. We can agree on some outcomes, perhaps, that are clearly not going to be perfect, but maybe some, like a homeless person is no longer homeless, or somebody who might have gone into care doesn't go into care. Those might be things that would, generally speaking, be desirable. And potentially the SIB allows the freedom for that sort of relationship approach, or that whatever it is that happens with that particular individual can be designed around that individual, because there isn't all this machinery of we've got to achieve all these outputs in order to achieve the outcomes that we want. So it's just a saying that it doesn't have to be that SIBs are designed on this A plus B equals C. It's actually that SIBs can leave quite a lot of space for those sort of holistic interventions and relationships with people to deliver outcomes.
Thank you. Gentlemen?
Hi, I'm Graham Dixon, Agencia. Looking at social impact bonds as a means of funding a project, which we stumbled across in terms of people who are addicted to opioid painkillers, and we got some funding for a pilot, demonstrated great results, and the complexity actually isn't as you put it, which you do A and it produces B, because in our project that proved quite straightforward to demonstrate. The complexity is within the system that breaks down outcomes that may not apply directly to who's bearing the cost, and also getting the learning out there. We use big data, we use complicated solutions, we put treatment plans in place. The thing that made the biggest difference to the impact was we training the receptionist how to answer the telephone call that came in from the client, so that they then were willing to come forwards. And the final thing about that was reaching out to people in an addicted population. Because we reached out, the actual response was 50% female, 50% male, and in most addiction services it's about a 70-30 side. So by making the service outreach and educating your first point of contact, we got fantastic results. We don't need a social impact bond to continue it, but actually the complexity of the system means that getting it funded becomes quite a powerful mechanism for moving that on.
There's a
And I think the perspective here is very Western and rich country, where governments pay a lot for services. So I come from Tunisia, which is a lower middle income country, and I've been traveling a lot in lower income country where there are almost no government services. And there is a lot of these services that are paid for by aid or, philanthropy. And definitely the way it's going today, it's wrong. You know, when you spend $70 million on textbooks that no one uses and declare this as a success. So if a SIB, I'm not saying like an impact bond is the best solution, but the question for us now, if I say give you $70 million and I want girls to move from primary to secondary, because we know this is like they marry later, they get less children, their family are healthier, etc. And I give you the flexibility and innovation. It's either to build toilets or menstrual hygienes or teachers or working with parents. So I give that actually flexibility to develop for that context the solution and actually pay you for that outcome. That's for me already like 180-degree better than giving them 70 million, telling them you have to buy a textbook for every girl. Now, there is probably even a better one, like you can improve from that, but for us it is at least an entry in bringing that flexibility rather than being extremely prescriptive.
All right, one final comment, and then I'll let the panelists comment or question.
Chi Hung Sin from Traverse. I've got two comments. One is really like the whole point about the relationships, because what I've always said from the start was we are hiding behind SIBs as a technical tool and it's a technocratic exercise. But actually, when you look at it as a relational, it's a point of entry into relationships, and reconfiguring that is that much more powerful, because in a whole complex system, you know, people aren't necessarily persuaded just by the evidence that this works. It's actually about that sense making in the system that we accept that it works and we understand that these things work. The other observation from my day one experience in the different panels is, I think I've always thought of SIBs as almost a logical development from the UK, because in the UK and in North America, parts of North America, a lot of the fundamental building blocks existed, like partnerships, like outcomes focus, like evidence. But then once it came out of the system and became an idea, it got transplanted into context where it is now being used to drive the building of those foundation blocks, because they don't exist. So I think we need to shift the narrative about what SIBs are for, away from this framing from high-income Western countries, and to start looking, therefore, at how do we look at success, because the use of SIBs is very different when it's moved out of high-income countries, as you know, other colleagues have observed.
That's great. I'm going to stop there, at least to give the panel a chance to respond. So if we could just go down the line and spend maybe 2 minutes responding to the question or comment that most resonates or you're most interested in.
So for me, I mean, I think this sort of framing that what we've been doing hasn't been sufficient really resonates. And I think both at sort of the specific intervention level, I think it's sort of the structure of how we organize welfare systems. There's a lot that hasn't been working, and I don't see any risk of SIBs dramatically taking over the world. And from my perspective, we need to be trying a whole bunch of different things, and that this is one of those things, but it's not been the only one, and there'll be lots of other ideas. And part of this, that's sort of part of the cycle of innovation ultimately that we need, both at the intervention level, but also at sort of this broader, how do we organize ultimately ourselves as a society?
Thank you. Carolyn.
So you can trace, I think, some of these, the roots for SIBs all the way back to the 1800s, as Mildred said, where we were talking about the science of administration, and let's bring the private sector in and make the public sector more private-like. That literally is in classic public administration writings of the 1800s. And I feel like so in the U.S. we've been talking about evidence-based policy now for some time, and it undergirds the SIPRA, the act that the provision that we now have $100 million to fully explore. So we have federal agencies. So why are we paying attention to this? We have federal agencies that are now, by legislation, required to try these things in the Department of Labor and Department of Education. And so, I just see this as one more iteration of we've had performance, the Government Performance Results Act. We've had these new public management reforms all over the world pushing for outcomes. This is just another version of it. And it is probably more complicated, and again, it's another invitation to the private sector, the social investors, to come in. And I literally heard a lot of rhetoric at the start of this is like, oh yeah, we're going to show government how it's done, and government can just get out of the business of providing and pay for outcomes, and everybody will be better off. And I think some are going to fall on their sword, and there may be some successes and advances, just like we've seen as we bring new ideas and try new things. But I don't see this as this big wave, and it'll come through, and there'll be something else afterwards, which you're already onto, and others are already onto.
Stay tuned. Adrian.
So I'm certainly not saying that SIBs are worse than things that have gone before, and we're not taking a step forward in that case from just spending $70 million on something which is completely worthless, and we can put that $70 million into something which is at least focused on outcomes. What I'm saying is that, and to answer your question as well here, if we are building it around the measurement of an outcome and the achievement of an outcome, that is a reductionist way of thinking about the world. There's no kind of getting away from that. So even though within it might, and this, I accept the fact it can help encourage relationships and all of those wonderful complexity things sort of within the SIB, we've still got this wrapper around it. For I think no good reason, actually. We've got this wrapper around it, which places it in, I think, a rather unfortunate, uncomfortable mindset. Why not? Let's all decide today that we don't need that wrapper, and we can actually think of better ways of encouraging the spending of the 70 million on things that are worthwhile, the collaboration and the relationship forming that we need, the empathy and humanity that we want to see back in public services. We can actually think of better ways of encouraging those things that don't require the identification of a specific outcome, the pricing of that outcome, and the payment of payments based on that outcome.
Thank you.
I agree with what Adrian said totally. If your goal is flexibility and relationships and innovation, why is SIBS the starting point? Why is it the best entry point? Why don't we start with research and practice around how to build the capacity for collaboration, how to allow flexibility in a system without misbehavior of all sorts. And I think that there's just wonderful opportunities for building that kind of a public sector response, but thinking about how do you set the protections to make sure you don't get the abuses in it. And I guess the idea was that the outcome measurement and payment scheme was going to be that protection, and I'm not sure that it is. And so we might want to think about protections that require us to think more about the social nature of humanity and the services we're creating. And I think we're actually capable of thinking of a more complex and socially based system that allows for flexibility and collaboration without abuse and corruption, without having to use some sort of really narrow, positivistic market measure tool. I think we could challenge ourselves to go there. It would be harder work, but I think it would be really fruitful.
We're at time, but as is always the case, we're still going to take one more question at least. So, Lorca, please.
Hi, really appreciated the panel, really interesting discussions, great to hear about complex systems, and I'd agree with a lot of what was said, except maybe one of the points regarding how SIBs, were conceived in austerity. But I feel they were maybe conceived actually in the mid-2000s as potentially a product to try and get investment to go somewhere and find something, and then they were born into austerity. And all the conversations we have are about trying to improve the delivery of public services with this model. But my big question is where does the investment go instead? Where do we think it should go? Because if it's not going to work here, should it just be focused on profit and then we can tax the profit, or what's the other option?
I mean,
Carolyn,
in
Mildred?
some sense, you gave one answer, I think that Mildred probably say, yeah, so tax the corporate profits more and put them more into the services that should eventually benefit them, right? So if we are taking care of children when they're young and giving them everything they need to grow up healthy, they'll be more productive workers for the corporate sector later, and they should value that, right? So, I don't know.
I'll just add, I think when I've looked at what, in the deals, at least in the US, where the investment dollars come from, a huge share of them are coming from philanthropic sources. So I'm not convinced that there is sort of, this tool has proven that it can absorb sort of commercial investment in that context. And frankly, there's not nearly the volume of deal flow to, I think, make a big enough impact in sort of the broader capital markets here. And I think it's pretty hard for me to sort of see the math that gets us to a place where we might even make a dent in where those dollars could go in this tool.
So the kids who go to business school at Cornell are all excited about a triple bottom line, that they can make money while doing social good and being environmentally responsible. The SIB idea is to make that true and to do that in the private market, because many of the problems that we have are actually generated by the fact that real wages haven't grown since the 1970s. We've got the greatest inequality in 100 years. Corporations aren't paying taxes. Taxes are mostly borne by lower and middle income people because our tax systems have become regressive rather than progressive. So the reason why there's all that money sitting at the top looking for a place to go is because we have dismantled the more egalitarian sharing of wealth systems. And that's what we really need to think about. And I think we could build partnerships with our young colleagues in business school who are going to business school really believing that the triple bottom line is a possible reality. And so take what we've learned from SIBs and what's possible and invite the private sector to step up the table and to reform its own behavior, not just to use this to reform the public sector.
Last words? Okay. Well, obviously much more to say. Fascinating discussion. We're over time, so please join me in thanking the panel.
So that's almost the end of the first day. If I can just take 3 minutes of your time. I know it's been a long day and you're all eager to get out and pick up some of these themes. My name's Nigel Ball. I'm the Executive Director here at the Go Lab. You'll hear a little bit more from me tomorrow, as you will from some of our panelists here. I just want to share a few reflections on the day and then talk a little bit about tomorrow, if you'll bear with me just for a few minutes. So it's been a fascinating day. I think a lot of similar themes have come out from all over the world, and that's very instructive. I think that this panel in particular has brought out that there's something in a lot of the discussions about worldview, and worldview is an important component of the discussion, which it's not all about pragmatism, but actually how you view the world is also a really important element of this. This idea of global perspective and a sort of Western or developed world versus the developing world perspective is really, really an important one, and one that we can bring out more tomorrow. I know from my own experience working in the developing world, which is often a very low trust environment, that actually there's utility in these sorts of structures which you may not need in a developed country where there's much higher levels of trust. So I think that's something that we need to perhaps explore coming out of this panel. I think we've learned something about impact bonds. One of the things we've learned is that they're really difficult to define. Those of you that came to this conference last year may remember we had just launched a report at the Go Lab called Building the Tools, and in it we shared a diagram which was sort of seeing SIBs as 4 dimensions that you could adjust rather than one thing that you can define, and that's definitely come out in the discussions today. And I think, again, we need to be careful when we're having these sorts of conversations that we're really talking about the same thing. I'm not saying there aren't fundamental similarities, but someone describes SIBs more as a set of principles than a model, and I think that it goes back to the worldview point, but it's a really important thing we must keep front of mind. The other thing that we've talked about quite a bit is risk and the difficulty of appropriately locating risk across different stakeholders, and who should be taking the financial risk and who should be taking the reputational risk of when things go right and wrong. And risk discussion isn't necessarily only relevant to social impact bonds. Any form of delivery which involves multiple actors has to work out what to do about risk and who is going to stand up, in perhaps a room like this and account when something goes wrong. That's something that you always have to answer. So I think the risk discussion is one that we need to go into in much more depth. I think that we have learned that the real challenge is in implementation. I think that's something probably the whole room on, that actually the implementation of social policies is really important. We've heard a lot about feedback loops. We've heard that feedback loops are one of the great things about impact bonds. We've also heard that feedback loops are one of the great things about new sort of complexity-based approaches. So there's a definite theme there that I think probably everyone can agree on. And we've also heard quite a bit that SIBs are a trigger or a catalyst or a Trojan horse, or a way to kind of kick a system to do something differently. And I think that putting apart worldviews and particular perhaps ideological perspectives, wouldn't it be great if, don't we all wish the world was like this? For a lot of people, particularly perhaps those working in government, but perhaps also those working outside of government, you don't get your wishes. You don't get your 3 wishes like we had at the start. You need to find other ways of making change. And I think that a lot of people are viewing SIBs as that. But I guess the note just to end on is that whatever else we've heard today, we've heard some really, really inspiring stories. And I hope you've all heard some of those stories. I certainly have, particularly in some of the parallel sessions, and particularly from providers. And I think that we all heard from Educate Girls this morning. I also heard from a homelessness project in Manchester, West London zone. Really, really exciting, inspiring stuff going on. And whether that was the SIB or whether it was something else is a question we would all love to answer. But certainly there's great work going on and something that we can all kind of take away and feel, I hope, really, really inspired by. So those of you that are sort of going, oh my goodness, this is complicated, now I don't know what to think. Well, actually, the most important thing you can do is go and do something different. Because you might just improve things, and if nothing else, we'll all learn something really, really useful. Remember that new ideas always start with compelling rhetoric, and everyone gets very excited and jumps on a bandwagon. And if we'd been in this room 5, 10 years ago talking about SIBs, we might have been at that point. Now I think we've learned a lot. We're being more reflective. Other new ideas are coming along and exciting us, but let's remember they will have limitations too, which is, you can only learn in one direction. So I think just keep that in mind as you're reflecting tonight, and keep the discussions going over dinner, and we'll look forward to coming back tomorrow. I'll just say a little bit about what tomorrow's got in store, if someone can do the slides for me. So here's the program. We're up early, so don't get too trolleyed tonight. For those of you that were in the pub quiz last night, you'd get the reference there. We have these roundtable sessions, 8:45. They should be really fun. They're going to be very discursive. We've brought some really, really great people into all 3 of those sessions, and quite a number of really influential voices. So they should be really good interactive discussions. Please do make the effort to come along. Have your cornflakes and come along early for those. Then we're going to look a little bit at the things in the parallel sessions. And then in the afternoon, we'll talk a little bit about some of our work exploring alternative approaches here at the Go Lab. So we publish a report called Rallying Together, where we're picking up some of the ideas perhaps that Adrian has talked about on this panel. We're going to talk about transparency. Mildred mentioned the lack of transparency. That's something that we also agree should be addressed in this space. And we're going to close by looking at what's next. And John will be back to share his thoughts and views on that closing panel tomorrow. As for tonight, you've got, well, 45 minutes now to, if you like, go back to your hotels and freshen up if you wish. Dinner will start here at 6 o'clock. Sorry, drinks will start here at 6 o'clock, sponsored by Ecarus. Thank you very much, Ecarus, for that. And between 6:30 and 8 out here in the forum. And after dinner, if that's not enough and you just can't get enough of the conversation, we'll be convening in the pub up the road called the Victoria. And to get to the Victoria, here's a map. You just go out the front of the building and you turn right away from the city centre and you'll see the Victoria about a 5-minute walk away on the right-hand side. So thank you all very much indeed and see you in an hour or so for dinner.